Hi, hello. I'm your host, Chloe. Today, I will be talking about Independent Study, written by Joelle Charbonneau. This is the second book in the Testing trilogy. As always, the full-length episodes such as this one include spoilers. If you would like to listen to a spoiler-free mini episode on this book, simply click episode 2A, Independent Study. As you can probably tell by the length of this episode, I had a lot to say. The script was 15 full pages, 11-point font, single-spaced. Frankly, I put a lot more effort into it than I did most of my papers this semester, so joking. Mostly. Anyway, I hope you listen to the entire episode and I don't lose you, and I hope that you enjoy it. In this episode, I will be discussing the redirection and removal of university students, inductions, the Tosu City students, new characters, Sia's university studies, and the rebellion. Let's talk about lit. As I mentioned in episode 2A, one of the things that I did not like about this book was the class downsizing that continued into the university. If you recall, I found the already incredibly small class size questionable, so you can imagine how I felt when it continued to shrink. This began with the early studies final examination, which served two purposes. One, to evaluate which field to place each student in, and two, to redirect any student who did not pass. After Obadiah fails this examination and reports for redirection, Sia eavesdrops on a conversation between Dr. Barnes and a female official. On page 27, she hears, "It is such a waste. He should have been one of the stars of this class. There should be another way." "Procedures are in place for a reason, Mei Lin. This country can't afford to change course now, not when we are finally beginning to make real progress. You know what to do with him." Obadiah's body is revealed and loaded into a skimmer as the two officials continue their conversation. It's unclear as to how he was executed or what they plan to do with his body. Mei Lin mentions the president's growing concerns and suspicions surrounding the policies of the testing and the university, which are quickly dispelled by Dr. Barnes. The systematic executions of students who fail are justified by the rationale that they would either fail in the future or turn against the United Commonwealth government and dismantle the system that they put into place. Essentially, they would rather kill children and prevent the possibility of a future revolution or failure than allow them to live and develop their own ideas or make mistakes. I think that this is another facet of the memory wipes. If university students remembered the horrors of the testing, they would be less likely to conform to their continued exploitation. On page 46, Michael reveals that government studies students who are not assigned an internship are also redirected. Considering that there are more students in the government studies class than there are internships, due to the additional students, which I'll get to later, that means that a handful of students will be redirected. Logistically, I'm not really sure why they could not simply create more internships. There should either be an established number of students and internships that are constant each year, or they should be able to accommodate to the fluctuating number of students each year. On page 193, during the formal induction day ceremony, Professor Holt says the following: "Sadly, not all students who demonstrate the intellect required of government studies students also work well with others. We work hard to identify those students early in their careers so they can be redirected into more appropriate fields. Because of this, only 12 of the 16 initially directed into this field will embark upon studying it. It is our hope we will not need to reevaluate the 12 of you remaining in the future." I find it rather convenient that 4 of the students miraculously disappeared or were killed during the induction challenges so that we wouldn't have to see the consequences of too many students and too few internships. Later, on page 215, Professor Holt says the following: "Unfortunately, after meeting with your final year guides and talking to your professors, we have concerns that some of you are not up to the challenges thus far presented. We have taken your academic achievements up to now into consideration when assigning internships. Some of you might be disappointed with the choices we have made, but we do so in the best interests of your future and the future of the United Commonwealth. Remember, while we consider these internships essential to your education, your classwork is just as important. Alternative arrangements will be made for students whose work falls below acceptable standards." Holt's speeches, as well as the mix of conversations with Michael and other characters, informs us the university continues to redirect students if they do not meet the additional guidelines placed before them. I understand that there must be continually high stakes and conflict, but I think that continuing to remove students for failure does not make the most sense. It's time to talk about the induction challenges. I'm going to cover the government studies induction by giving a brief recap of a challenge, sharing my thoughts on it, and then moving on to the next. On technicality, the government studies induction begins with the doors to each new student's bedroom being locked. The students had to find a way to unlock their door, or otherwise remove it, and make their way downstairs before the time ran out. The order that they arrived downstairs determined the order that they met with Professor Holt to talk about their schedules. I thought that this certainly was an exciting start to the induction. The students had only been in their rooms for a very short period of time before the doors were locked, windows covered, and the lights shut off. This was disorienting and left them with no time to prepare how to escape. I do wonder about the mechanics behind this and why they weren't utilized again later. It seems like a lot of trouble to install a sort of electromagnetic lock and window shutters. My one complaint with this first challenge is that I am unsure of its relevance to the government studies. It definitely challenged the new students to think quickly on their feet and use ingenuity, but it had nothing to do with teamwork or otherwise relevant knowledge. I think it would have been more interesting if each room housed 2 students, so they would have had to work together in order to escape. The induction officially begins with a siren wake-up call. The students load into skimmers to be escorted to an undisclosed location. There, Ian gives them their first round of instructions. He explains that they will work in teams of 4 to visit a list of locations. He says it best on page 83. At each destination is a task you and your fellow team members must finish. Upon completion of the task, your team will receive a marker as proof of your success. Each team must have all 4 markers in its possession when it returns to the government studies residence. Any team that returns without 1 or more of the markers will be penalized. Sia is selected to be a team captain, which gives her the responsibility of choosing the rest of her team members kickball style. She chooses Will, then Enzo, then asks Enzo to choose the last team member as it is between 2 Tosu City students. I thought that Sia's choice to have Enzo pick the last team member was a smart move and a strong one for a leader to make. She acknowledged that she didn't know enough to make an educated decision, so she trusted someone more educated to make the decision for her. Again, the humility in this choice is a testament for her placement in the university. Leaders will not always know which choice is the right one. Responsible leaders know when such a decision is before them, and they turn to others for help. The hint for the first location is found on page 88. A silver treasure was brought here to eat, mate, and rest. Can you now find what is left of this treasure's nest? Sia, Will, and Damone are locked inside a building, with Enzo outside, after they accidentally spring a trap set by the final year government studies students. In order to exit the building, the team must maneuver through a series of rooms and hallways. They encounter a hyperbolically large snake, which nearly kills Damone before he is saved by Sia. They make it outside and regroup with Enzo before moving on to a gorilla enclosure. This task involves solving 3 mathematical equations and entering the answers into a keypad on a locked box. If the team is wrong once, the box will not accept input for 1 hour. Kind of like my phone whenever it doesn't register my fingerprint. If the team is wrong twice, there is an unknown consequence. Sia's team answers all 3 questions correctly the first time and makes their way out of the enclosure. Griffin's team, which includes Raph, enters 2 incorrect answers. Their box explodes. Sia rushes back into the enclosure and helps Raph, who was injured in the blast. I liked the inclusion of a familiar environment, such as a zoo, in a dilapidated state that the characters had to navigate. This is reminiscent of the first novel's setting in Chicago, but I'm unfamiliar with the city. A zoo is something that readers are more likely to have experiences with. I thought that the snake and its description felt a bit misplaced since no other animals have posed threats to the characters. I am intentionally excluding the creatures from the final phase of the testing. This stage of the induction again testifies to Sia's character and her desire to help others because it is the right thing to do. She did not have to put herself into danger again in order to save Damone, who continually challenges her, but she did. She did not have to go back to help Raph, who is on a different team, but she did. I will say that was probably my favorite moment of the novel. It was simplistic, but it stuck with me after I finished reading. On page 112, Will and Damone share an idea of sabotaging the remaining team's skimmers. Sia responds by saying, "No, we don't need to sabotage other teams to succeed." This also demonstrated consistency of her principles. This task did require teamwork, but again, I'm unsure of the relevance to the field of government studies. I like a giant man-eating snake and explosions as much as the next person, but I would like some more rationale as to why they're included in the book. The hint for the second location is found on page 112. Go to the place where armed vehicles once left the ground for the sky. Your next clue and task wait there for your team to try. This brings Sia and her team to an old Air Force base. In order to get the instructions for the next task, they must first lock one of their teammates in a metal box that has weight and thermal sensors. Sia, with the smallest build of her team, is volunteered by Damone. She reluctantly agrees and is locked inside of the box. An unknown amount of time passes before Sia is released. Will and Enzo had to tie Damone to a tree because he wanted to abandon Sia the moment that they completed the task and got the next hint. Once she is free, Enzo says that they should cut Damone free. Will, on the other hand, wants to leave him because he says it's what he deserves. Sia is conflicted, as we see on page 123. Will is right. Damone should understand what it feels like to be betrayed. Leaders, real leaders, must think of others before themselves. They need to consider the consequences of their actions and only sacrifice lives when the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And I realize, as much as I want to penalize Damone for his cowardly actions, I cannot. Not without performing the same kind of act I am condemning Damone for. I am this team's leader. I will not leave someone I am in charge of behind. She cuts him free, ignoring his scathing remarks, and the team sets out to find the next location. Since I live on an Air Force base, I was very excited to see one featured in the book. I will say, though, that the vague descriptions are kind of disappointing. It sounds like Charbonneau hasn't been on the base she's writing about. I personally think that including an outdated military installation as an induction location for government studies students but not actually having the students enter the base is a wasted opportunity. I do understand that the rebel camp is based there, and I think that having Sia stumble upon it without knowing what it is a brilliant idea. It allowed for ambiguity while the reader waited to see what was there, while also providing a clear transition into the next stage of the novel. I appreciate the momentary lapse that Sia has, driven by her fear of a near-death experience and resentment towards the person who wanted to leave her there. As expected, though, she composes herself and rationalizes the situation. She has the mindset and compassion required of a leader. I will say that this was my least favorite task out of the induction because we didn't see almost any of it, and I know I sound like a broken record, but I'm unsure of its relevance to the field of government studies. The hint for the third location is found on pages 125 to 126. The end is in sight. The next stop is near. In the foundation of our commonwealth you shall search. Look for the symbol of where you now live and find what you seek upon its perch. The group unanimously decides to travel to the central government building. Tensions are raised between the members of the group as they argue about how to best approach finding the symbol. Sia takes the initiative and asks the secretary if she could give them an idea of where to look, and she informs the team that the symbol is on the back of the moderating justice's chair. The moderating justice is, of course, President Colander. Sia leads the team into the back of the debate chamber and devises a plan to approach the chair. She recalls the petition process to obtain access to the floor and perfectly recites it. President Colander grants her access and, when Sia asks, hands her an envelope. Sia notices Professor Holt and Dr. Barnes in the audience before exiting the chamber with her team. I both loved and hated this task. I loved that it encapsulated a specific shred of knowledge that government studies students should know, considering the cultural value and governmental implications of such a process. I hated this task because one of the two Tosu City students was completely ignorant of this, while the other claimed to know it without acting on it, when they're supposed to have almost every advantage. In addition, a colony student from a much larger colony was also ignorant of this. Sia, who comes from the smallest of the 18 colonies, not only recalls learning about this petition process, but is able to recite it verbatim. While this does provide further support for her placement in government studies, I don't think that it makes sense. I understand that this is used as a plot device because it lands her internship, which I will be talking about shortly, but I feel it's shoehorned in. I would even argue that this makes Sia look overpowered, which was a complaint that I had with her engineering skills in the first installment. It's necessary to have a primary skill or skill set, but you enter dangerous territory when that skill or skill set becomes too overpowered and convenient. A lot of that falls onto the author's lap as they can tailor situations to the skills of a character and vice versa. The hint for the fourth and final location is found on page 140. The end is near. You'll soon be done. Now it's time to have some fun. Return to the place where you embarked on this quest. Induction awaits for those who complete one last test. The team concludes that this note is referring to the government studies dormitory. Once they arrive at the dorm, they realize that the bridge is missing. Sia estimates the divide to be about 20 feet across and hundreds of feet deep. Their final instructions are to, quote, come home. At their disposal, on their side of the divide, is a collection of supplies, such as rope, that could be used to construct a bridge. After a brief reprieve from arguing, Sia realizes that this task was designed to be impossible. She sits down by a tree and tells her team that she will not be doing anything, as they are not expected to. The others question her choice, especially Damone, but they allow her to explain and eventually join her. Once they do, Dr. Barnes and Professor Holt give Ian the cue to connect the bridge. Sia's team is the first to return to the residence and successfully present all markers. I think that this was a very creative task and a strong way to finish the government studies induction. Designing a task to be impossible in order to show future leaders that some problems cannot be fixed deserved its place in this induction. Sometimes there are problems without solutions, and sometimes there are problems with solutions that cannot be currently achieved. You have to know when you are incapable of solving a problem, either currently or indefinitely. In this case, the students do not have the appropriate supplies to complete the task at hand. Any attempt could result in injury or death. Like in Until Dawn, sometimes doing nothing is the best decision. It's too bad that this mindset is completely abandoned going into the third and final book. I didn't like that this task made Sia seem so overpowered and inept at the same time. She has been established to be a prodigy of sorts in mechanical engineering, yet she did not notice until this point that the bridge was built with the ability to retract. She even makes note of this on page 144, saying, "While I'm surprised to find the bridge missing, I'm more disconcerted that I hadn't previously noticed the bridge was built to retract." Her feats of engineering, some of which we have yet to see, make her out to be brilliant and more than capable. I find it out of character that someone with her skills of observation and interest in engineering would casually and intentionally overlook a bridge that she must cross every single day, especially after seeing the mechanical modifications that were made to the dormitory itself. My conclusion is that Sia did not notice this prior to this point in the novel purely for the sake of convenience. If she would have noticed it, the reveal of the missing bridge would not have been as shocking for the readers. Charbonneau sacrificed character consistency for convenience. I also have mixed feelings about Sia being the first person in the entirety of her government studies class to figure out the impossible task. On one hand, she is the protagonist. Since the novel is written from her perspective in first person, it would make sense that the readers would make this discovery with her. Her intelligence is indisputable, so it's not a major leap that she could figure this out, especially considering she figured out Roman's deception during the third phase of the testing. On the other hand, it's less satisfying when the protagonist is able to figure out something so complex without any aid or discussion, especially in situations such as this where teamwork is necessary in order to succeed. It is less believable that the other students on her team, as well as the students on the other teams, are as intelligent and skilled as she is when they are unable to match her stride. They are the most promising young minds of the country and the very future of the United Commonwealth. Why, then, do they all pale in comparison to Sia in instances such as this? Overall, I found the government studies induction to be entertaining and thrilling. I do think that some of the tasks failed to be relevant to her field of study since they were meant to further evaluate students' aptitude in their new roles. I would like to briefly touch on Thomas's and Statia's inductions, as they were both mentioned in passing dialogue and I found them to be interesting. On page 175, Thomas shares his biological engineering induction experience, which took place in a greenhouse that's located in the campus stadium. It consisted of, quote, 7 stations where students were required to identify plants or animals by touch or smell or by reading lines of their genetic code. A correct answer meant passing to the next station. An incorrect one required the first-year student to face a physical challenge. Failure to pass the physical challenge resulted in elimination from the obstacle course and redirection out of the biological engineering program and the university. Thomas describes the physical challenge that he had to complete for his incorrect answer, a, quote, 100-foot-long, 15-foot-wide path filled with hazardous plant life he had to navigate before being allowed to proceed to the next station. On page 177, he discloses that there were 15 of us first years when we first started initiation. Only 8 made it through. 5 of us from the colonies and 3 from Tosu City. I was impressed and intimidated by the challenges of the biological engineering induction. I was also surprised that this little blurb that only lasts 2 pages was more cohesive and relevant than the 100 pages that were used to describe the government studies induction. These stations were a ruthless and concise way to evaluate the knowledge of the new students, and I'm disappointed that we didn't see more of it. At first, I thought it was odd that more colony students passed his induction than Tosu City students, but I think it makes more sense when you consider the recently revitalized and more rural land of the colonies where the students would be more likely to encounter such specimens. On page 210, Stacia shares her medical induction experience. Quote, first years were asked to select the correct treatments for a dozen common diseases with the help of a medical textbook. Once answers were given, each student was taken to a treatment room. On the table inside, 12 sets of medications sat waiting to be dispensed to patients who, one by one, walked through the door. The medication inside the cup representing the correct answer was a placebo. Wrong answers contained poison. Stacia continues by saying, the final years made us watch each patient take their medication. They wanted to test our confidence in diagnosis and our ability to cope with losing a patient. I guess some people have trouble living with a mistake that causes someone else to die. Anyone who demonstrated psychological unfitness or gave more than 2 incorrect answers was redirected. Sia is stunned and asks if the patients who were given the incorrect cup were actually poisoned. Stacia says she was unsure, but it appeared that they died upon consumption. Again, I was shocked and intimidated by the challenges of this medical induction. I was surprised that this blurb that only lasted 1 page was more cohesive and relevant than the 100 pages used to describe the government studies induction. These challenges required precision and confidence in addition to the required rudimentary medical knowledge. When I read about this induction, just like with the biological engineering induction, I was intrigued and disappointed that we didn't see more. I think that it's weird that Charbonneau wrote such relevant and concise challenges for fields of study that Sia is not in. I also wonder if Dr. Barnes observed all inductions or if he was just present for the government studies induction. If the latter is true, is it just because of Sia? Also, what were the other 2 inductions like? How were the education students evaluated? What about mechanical engineering students? I want to know. That is definitely one success of this book. What Charbonneau wrote leaves me wanting to know more. If only she was obliged to provide it. As I stated in episode 2A, I loved the addition of the Tosu City students. It was unexpected and it added depth to the overall story. The corruption of the testing and university officials run much deeper than we anticipated, and there is no attempt to conceal their prejudice. First and foremost, the Tosu City students are not required to complete the testing. Instead, they are given a much less demanding alternative. They submit an application, complete an interview, and take the early studies examination that the colony students take. The students who pass the exam are accepted into the university. I felt a fire ignite when I read this. How could these students be spared from such horrors simply because they are legacies? How could they not be subjected to torture and death? This perspective alone gives the simmering rebellion significant momentum, especially with the readers. We have been given yet another reason to support the dismantling of this brutal system. Second, to play further into prejudices, the Tosu City students are educated on each and every colony student that passed the testing, strengths and weaknesses included. On pages 76 and 77, Sia and Enzo discuss this advantage. Part of our early studies was to study not only the colonies, but the students they sent to Tosu who would be attending the university with us. We may not have set foot onto campus until today, but our instructors have made sure we know about you. We studied you because our instructors wanted us to know our competition. I am curious as to why only the Tosu City students were educated about the other side. Obviously, it's to give them some kind of edge, but it really isn't explored further. It also makes me wonder why they accept colony students at all. Not because they are any less intelligent or capable, but because it would be a lot less trouble to just funnel in more Tosu City students. The officials clearly want to continue the cycle of legacies in order to retain their power. The prejudices are not exclusive to the officials either. Many of the Tosu City students bear their own bias. Damone is a prime example of this, with his continual remarks against Will and Sia during their induction, and his targeting of Sia once they have been formally inducted. I'm always baffled by the upper class in stories like this. Their entitlement leads them to believe that they are leagues above their competition, that they stand at no opposition, yet they would not survive without the physical and intellectual contributions of those in the classes below them. Here, those in the colonies. According to a comment made by Enzo in passing, the prejudice is further stratified within the upper class. I'm making the generalization that all citizens of Tosu City are the upper class. Even those from the city faced hardships, such as lack of funding and support from their representatives in the government. The corruption and greed runs deep, and it even affects the privileged. What's a new installment without new faces? There was a trio of such characters that stuck out to me that I would like to discuss now: Ian, Raph, and Enzo. I found some moments for each of these three that I want to mention. Ian. Michael tells Sia on page 44 that there are upperclassmen in the university who belong to the rebellion. Sia develops a suspicion that Ian may be one of these rebels, especially after he changes the guide assignments so she is in his group. At several points throughout the book, such as on pages 156 to 160 and on pages 204 to 207, Ian seeks Sia out to give her warnings and assistance when he is able to. He even shows her on page 195 how to take her bracelet off and informs her that they swapped microphones for tracking devices, which is convenient considering the person who figured out that the bracelets had microphones during the testing completely forgot about their possibility when divulging all secrets to Thomas in the chicken coop, only to remember them later. I liked that there was some uncertainty surrounding Ian and his motivations, especially since he discloses that he has been charged with keeping an eye on Sia and reporting anything suspicious. While I had the feeling that he belonged to the rebellion because few other upperclassmen even make appearances, there was still room to wonder which faction he would belong to, if he was indeed a member of the rebellion. I think that Ian made a pleasant addition to the cast of minor or supporting characters, and the air of mystery added to the overall intrigue of the story. Raph. Let me start this by saying that I love Raph. Raph is an icon. If you don't love him yet, your adoration for him will likely grow while you read the last book. I appreciated that Raph was shown to be intelligent, like on page 163 when he discovers that the bridge task was meant to be unsolvable, but also not the most intelligent, like on page 69 when he was unable to escape his room before the time ran out. While Raph makes a questionable first impression with Sia, as he is seen spending time with Griffin and Damone, he is quick to set the record straight on page 208. Just because we're all from Tosu City doesn't make us friends. I don't know about you, but friendship is a luxury I've never had time for. I was too busy beating out my competition to get here. This did sound harsh, but on the following page, he offers a comforting touch to Stacia after she recalls her brother with sadness. He later shows himself to be loyal, helpful, and kind. He acknowledges the kindness that Sia extended to him during the induction, and he respects her because of it. He comes to her room on page 245 to ask if there is anything he can do to help her with her workload. On page 272, he aids her after Damone attempts to kidnap or murder her, and then tells Thomas on page 274, Sia didn't need you to come to her rescue. She saved herself from Damone. He reveals that he had been keeping an eye on her after hearing of Griffin and Damone's plan, and lest we not forget, gives Sia the tapes the rebellion needs. Not that it really matters. He, in my opinion, proved himself loyal and worthy of her trust not just once, but several times. Enzo. Enzo is kind of difficult to read. He is typically reserved and keeps to himself. I must give credit where credit is due and acknowledge his subtle moments of kindness and loyalty. First, when the other 3 members of his team are locked inside of the building during the induction, he doesn't abandon them. He travels around the building to the other end and uses his voice to guide them outside on page 102. When Raph is burned during the explosion in the gorilla enclosure, Enzo offers up anti-infection ointment that he had packed in his bag on page 111. On page 119, he gives Sia a flashlight that he had also packed and promises her that they will get her out as soon as they can. He works with Will to secure Damone when he wants to abandon Sia and fulfills his promise. Enzo alludes to the disadvantages that even Tosu City citizens experience, which I briefly mentioned earlier. He is intelligent, as exhibited by his being the first to escape his room on page 69, and extends his kindness to those both on his team and those who are not. As I stated in episode 2A, I was pleased with Sia's university placement. While the obvious choice would have been to place her in the mechanical engineering field, I believe that she possesses skills that are valuable in the government studies field. Honestly, I really liked that Charbonneau made the choice to pursue Sia's more subtle qualities by placing her in government studies. It didn't give the protagonist what she wanted, which created conflict. It's much more interesting to watch Sia come into this role and embrace it than it would be to watch her excel with skills that we've already seen so much of. I will say, though, that I had some issues with her class schedule and her internship. As far as her schedule goes, I wish that it was explained more as to why she was given 9 classes. Just a little tidbit for all of my non-university friends, one average college class is worth 3 credit hours. To be considered a full-time student, someone must be enrolled in 12 credit hours or 4 classes. The average semester for most students is 15 credit hours, or 5 classes. The cap at most universities is 18 credit hours, or 6 classes. Sia is enrolled in the real-world equivalent of 27 credit hours. I know there's this whole shtick where Dr. Barnes and Professor Holt are watching her and she doesn't know why, but the readers don't know why either. Anytime that it is brought up, the characters only speak about it in generalities. I'm not really sure why they are keeping an eye on her, other than that she's the protagonist, and she's intelligent and skilled. I would just like some clarification. Why is her course load so much more demanding than everyone else's? If the sole reason is that they want her to fail, why did they pass her on to the university in the first place? Ian says on page 158, if you were from Tosu City, Dr. Barnes and Professor Holt would be praising your deductive reasoning. Instead, they are looking for a reason to eliminate you from the program because they're too worried you're too smart, that you could be too strong a leader. If this is the case, couldn't they have just failed her at the end of the testing or her early studies final examination? The officials have not shown any restraint in eliminating or redirecting students who fall below their standards or question them, so why do they spare Sia? Is she not posing a much greater threat by not only attending the university, but by being a government studies student? As far as her internship goes, I understand that it is a plot device. I understand that it is the most sensible way to carry the story forward based on what has already been established. But let me ask you this. If the desired outcome of the induction task to find the justice scales is to have all students successfully recite the petition, why does Sia get a newly invented internship placement for doing what is expected? I understand that it is more impressive for a colony student to do this than it is for a Tosu City student to, but what makes her so special other than that she's the protagonist? I'm acknowledging that the president wants to work with a colony student in order to learn more about the colonies and the testing, but I still feel that this is one of those, this happened because they're the protagonist, not because they deserve it situations. You can't have a YA dystopian novel without a good old-fashioned rebellion. It came as no surprise when the simmering rebellion was revealed. While some rebellions are relatively linear and lucid, the one being mounted against the testing serves more purposes than one, and they are not all what we anticipated. While Michael informally inducted Sia into the rebellion, it has yet to take the forefront. I want to wait until the next episode so I can discuss it in its entirety and in detail. As I did my research for this episode, I found that there were a handful of things that I wanted to cover that did not necessarily fit into any of the selected topics. I wanted to mention each of these thoughts. On page 121, when Sia is locked in the box and hears a skimmer motor, she thinks to herself, once again, I have trusted where trust was not warranted. Once again, I will suffer the consequences. I have several thoughts. Which betrayal is she referring to? While she has listened to the recording that she left on the transit communicator, the end of the first novel does not specifically mention betrayal in her message. She can't be talking about her team because Enzo did not abandon them during the first challenge. At this point in the novel, she hasn't experienced any instances where her trust was violated and she suffered the consequences. Even if she did remember Will's betrayal, which is alluded to, I would argue that the price was paid by Thomas because he was the one who was shot. I think that this is a minor hole that exists because Charbonneau knew something that her character didn't. Also, didn't I have a whole spiel about how she gave trust when it wasn't warranted, but she didn't give it a second thought? Also, I'm going to use that word convenience again, because even though it didn't explicitly say at the end of the first novel that Sia mentions Will's betrayal, in this novel, Sia alludes to remembering it after listening to the recording, and it's the whole thing with the memory wipe, which I'm about to get to here in a minute. Before I get to that, though, I want to talk a little bit more about betrayal. Speaking of betrayal, Sia has a very emotionally charged reaction to Thomas confirming that he still has his memories. Thomas clearly feels guilty and is also upset about this and admits that he didn't know how to tell her. I can only imagine how that felt. They formulated this plan together, but were not able to execute it together due to the constant surveillance that they were under after they completed the fourth phase of the testing, and limited opportunities to interact before the final interviews. He did not intentionally refrain from giving her the pill. He simply did not have an opportunity to do so. He likely has a form of survivor's guilt about being the only one in his class with his memories intact, especially considering the trauma that he endured. He accidentally killed one of the candidates from his colony who had a mental break and almost died from a gunshot wound to the torso. While there is a conflict of Sia's emotions internally, I felt that her reaction to him was callous and apathetic. I am by no means trying to invalidate her feelings or shame her for her response, but I will not shy away from the hypocrisy of her reaction. In the fourth phase of the testing, Sia encounters a man, who we have since learned to be Simon, who gives her supplies. She decides not to tell Thomas of their interactions and even lies to him about the food that she magically produces. When the man gives her a vial of an anti-truth serum, she does not tell Thomas. While she is unsure as to whether or not she trusts its purpose or its provider, she keeps it in order to take it for her benefit during the final interviews. She never tells Thomas about this. It could be argued that she doesn't remember, but even after her memories are fully restored, she still doesn't tell him. I would also argue that this was conveniently forgotten in order to create tension between the two of them and reader rejection directed towards Thomas. I just have to ask, how can she say that he betrayed her and that he cannot be trusted when she has kept things from him? Here's what I think should have happened. I think that if memory wipes were going to be implemented, Sia should have lost all of her memories of the testing completely. There should have been no way to recall any of them until she's triggered by the tapes or another event, such as a nightmare. Thomas should have played a more prominent role, the internal conflict he was experiencing always boiling under the surface. This could have sown some distrust between him and Sia as he struggles to find a way to guide her using what he remembers without being able to offer an explanation unless he reveals everything. I didn't feel like there was a satisfying payoff for two reasons. First, Sia maintains this weird middle state of recollection where she can remember things when it's convenient and forget things when it's convenient. Second, we see so little of Thomas's turmoil because we see so little of Thomas. Additionally, I think that it would have been an overall more satisfying and surprising reveal if we as readers had no idea whether or not he still had his memories. Since Sia listened to her message on the transit communicator and regained some of her memories, she was suspicious of Thomas from the start of the novel, and Michael kind of fed into this when he mentioned that he was observing her and Thomas to see if the memory wipe had been successful. I didn't feel that there was any ambiguity surrounding the success of their plan. If Sia had no recollection whatsoever, and Thomas was more prevalent, suspense and suspicions could have been developed throughout the novel and led to a much greater payoff. There you have it, my thoughts on Joelle Charbonneau's independent study. If you have stayed with me for the entirety of this episode, I appreciate you, and I hope that you enjoyed it and that you appreciated the work that I put in to make an episode this long. Join me next time for episodes 3A and 3B, Graduation Day. Let's talk about lit. Thanks for listening.